Senator and 2020 candidate Cory Booker unveiled a plan Monday addressing gun violence. The proposal echoes similar Democratic demands. It includes banning assault weapons, limiting handgun purchases, and enforcing existing gun laws better. It then goes further. Booker wants to require gun owners to not only go through a background check, but also obtain a license in order to purchase and own a firearm. 9 states currently have a measure like this in place, at least for handguns. One of those states is Booker's home state of New Jersey. Here's the Democrat on CBSN earlier.
If you live in communities like mine, where we see in America 100 people plus dying every single day to gun violence, ripping apart communities. I live in a low-income, inner-city, black and brown neighborhood where this is a daily fear that on the 4th of July, when fireworks go off, people talk about their kids showing signs of post-traumatic stress, hiding, anxiety, lying under the bed due to a firework. This is something that we have to all say enough is enough.
Joining me now is CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. We welcome back Washington Post reporter Sean Sullivan. He's also a CBSN political contributor. And Ed O'Keefe is back with us as well, CBS News political correspondent. So, Ed, let me start with you. Does Senator Booker's gun plan help set him apart in this very crowded field?
It does, in the sense that it's one of the more ambitious, meatier proposals when it comes to revamping the nation's gun laws or gun rights laws, gun control laws, depending on how you look at it. This idea of gun licensing, in addition to background checks, would go a little further than the next most ambitious gun plan that was put up by Kamala Harris just a few weeks ago. And in essence, Booker also by insisting on more executive actions, more executive orders, and doing so essentially immediately were he elected president, makes him a slightly more aggressive set of proposals than that from Senator Harris. And he's right when he speaks to the fact that this happens in his neighborhood. I think he referred this morning to a situation that had happened just in the last few days in Newark, where he was once mayor. He's talked about this at great length in the past. And, you know, also this, to me, appears designed to not only set him apart from Senator Harris, but also from Congressman Eric Swalwell, who got into this race recently, saying he would be the gun control candidate. Well, he hasn't released a plan quite like this, so you wonder what Swalwell will do now. Will he reveal something even more substantive, more aggressive than this, or does this potentially steal his thunder? And for a guy, Booker, who has struggled to sort of find a way to break out of this pack and distinguish himself, this has the potential to do it, if only because so much of what he's proposing in here is music to the ears of people who've been fighting to change the nation's gun laws for decades.
Well, a lot of candidates have been criticized for not rolling out policy specifics. And Caitlin, at this point, are there some campaigns that appear to be more successful at that, laying out specifics, than others?
Well, Elizabeth Warren, as we know, has been leading the field in terms of introducing policy proposals, but her polling numbers and fundraising to some extent hasn't really kept pace with the tone that she is setting with policy. You had last week Amy Klobuchar talking about her proposals to fight drug addiction. Candidates need to figure out ways to differentiate themselves from the other candidates, but also to get attention in the media and therefore among the people who are going to be participating in the primaries, and also to help fundraise. You can unveil a proposal and then kind of fundraise off of it and seize those moments to carve out a place for yourself. And policy is one way to do that. What's really interesting about these gun proposals, though, I've talked to gun rights activists, those advocating for curbs to gun ownership, saying that the politics has changed so rapidly on this issue that now it's becoming something of a litmus test within the Democratic Party to support proposals like the ones that Booker or Kamala Harris are proposing, whereas just a few years ago that was something that wasn't really even talked about, even among Democrats. And the politics has changed over the course of these mass shootings, and we've seen that reflected in the polling as well. The big question, though, is it going to be a driver of Democratic votes in the primary and in the general election? That still remains to be seen.
I wonder, Sean, are you hearing that too? Because it has been fascinating to watch the politics, as Caitlin is pointing out, that the politics on this issue have changed. And I wonder, among those lawmakers that you've spoken with, do they sense that? We have seen, for instance, in the wake of mass shootings, a number of young people, for instance, coalesce in a way that, frankly, we just hadn't seen before and become very vocal and very much made their presence felt on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. The politics have changed. I think lawmakers realize that. I think activists realize that. And I think these candidates themselves realize that. When you look at Senator Booker's proposal, this is something that we probably would not have seen a few years ago from a major Democratic presidential candidate. And so I think these candidates realize that they have to find a way to convince voters that they are serious on this issue and other issues. Caitlin brings up a great point. Elizabeth Warren is somebody who has put out a number of policy proposals across a number of fronts that have been detailed, that have been serious, that activists have said, this is some really serious stuff. But the reality is it hasn't broken through to the point that she is, shooting up the polls. She's still struggling in some states to gain traction, to build a following. So the key for these candidates is not just being serious about policy, but finding policies that are resonating with voters and finding ways to differentiate themselves from the other candidates. That's really the challenge right here. When you look at issues like health care, when you look at gun control, when you look at environmental issues, a lot of these candidates on paper look and sound the same. They stand for a lot of the same things. And when you have so many candidates, it tends to blur together in the minds of a lot of voters. And when I talk to voters on the campaign trail, they say, yeah, I like this candidate, I like this candidate. They seem to be where I am on gun control. They seem to be where I am on the environment. But how do you stand out? How do you set yourself apart in a field of 21 candidates where you have 21 people who, on a lot of issues, effectively sound exactly the same?
I also want to ask about the issue of gender. New York Times article out this weekend discusses the electability of a woman candidate, saying, quote, as women now campaign for president, they are encountering some of the same misogyny that Mrs. Clinton faced when she ran in 2016. They are running up against assumptions voters and pundits have about what presidential leadership looks like, battling a presidential archetype where men are the only touchstones. So, Caitlin, I wonder how much of this baggage from the 2016 election can we expect to be at the forefront of the 2020 election?
Well, we hear from a lot of Democratic strategists and operatives who are women saying that there hasn't been really a role model for winning a presidential election for women. And therefore, people kind of default to this question about whether a woman is, in fact, electable. You had a really interesting piece in the New York Times, as you mentioned, pointing to the number of women candidates in this race who have continued to win elections, and that's part of their pitch here.
They've already done it.
They've already done it, and they've done it in places. In some cases, Kirsten Gillibrand, for example, as someone who has won in red areas, and so that's part of the pitch that they are trying to make. And in order to kind of change the conversation, because we know that the top issue for voters right now is defeating Donald Trump, and women have an extra barrier in front of them when it comes to this question of electability, and what does that really mean?
Well, this same piece notes that Senator Kamala Harris has, quote, enjoyed most of her success thus far in Democratic strongholds. So, Ed, how are women candidates trying to break through to voters? Are there signs that they are succeeding, or is it too early to tell?
Well, I think of all of them, right now the most successful has been Warren, and even she has struggled a bit, and it has seen a bit of a rebound in part because of all these policy ideas that she may have. But I think the bigger lesson from that article, and part of why I thought it was so smart, is because it's a reminder that it's really early. Mm-hmm. Just because Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders sit atop the field right now doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. If you look back at 4, 8, 12 years ago, different people were in the lead that did not ultimately get the nomination. And I think, if anything, this is a reminder that this is still an incredibly unsettled field. Nobody's really committing to anyone at this point. I spoke at length this afternoon with somebody based out in Iowa, Democratic activist who meets with and helps organize events for a lot of different contenders. And he says, I talk to people every day, and nobody's really sold on any one person yet. They may have 4 or 5 people they're keeping an eye on and they like. And they're just waiting to see how the debates help shape this, how the ideas help shape this, and if some of these folks just have a big breakout moment that vaults them ahead. And he said, look, some of this might ultimately be settled by squabbling. If you see 1 or 2 fighting amongst themselves about something, some other person could break out of that pack and potentially vault into the lead. That's happened especially in Iowa in the past, where, for example, Dick Gephardt and Howard Dean were fighting with each other, and John Kerry somehow got ahead of them. It could happen again this time, and it could be one of those women who ultimately breaks out of that pack.
So we're talking about women candidates, but the two frontrunners in this race are former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. Ed, yes, it is very early, but Sean, I want to ask you about some of your recent reporting. How is Joe Biden's strong debut putting pressure on the other candidates?
Well, you know, when you look at Joe Biden's entrance into this race the last week and a half or so, it has been stronger in some respects than a lot of Democrats anticipated. They looked at Joe Biden as somebody who was not somebody that they thought necessarily could come in, for a lot of these Democrats at least, and shake up this race immediately. But the reality is he's raised a lot of money. He's shown and demonstrated an ability to put Trump on the defensive in a way that no other Democrat has really done or demonstrated. He's really proven to have gotten into President Trump's head, given the amount of time Trump has spent tweeting about him, responding to things that he has said. And when you look at these poll numbers, and again, it is very, very early, he is doing well. And so I think this has sort of shocked a little bit of Democrats into the reality that, for the moment at least, Joe Biden is a real contender that they're going to have to deal with, that they're going to be compared to. And we're seeing these candidates react in different ways. Bernie Sanders stands out from the field right now in the way that he's reacted. He's gone directly after Biden in the sense that he's compared his policies to him in a pretty direct way and said, look, when it comes to trade, when it comes to the Iraq war, we have very, very different records. He's not going to attack him personally, is what Sanders has said, but he's been very clear that he's happy to compare these policies. And some of these other candidates have been a little bit more reticent to do that. We've seen a little bit of contrast from Elizabeth Warren, but most of the candidates are sort of trying to, stick to their own lanes right now. But I think there's a recognition across the board in all of these campaigns right now that if you look at the amount of money that Joe Biden has raised, you look at the reception that he's gotten in some of these early states, they really need to take his candidacy seriously, and they really need to strategize accordingly in the next few weeks.
Well, Joe Biden made President Trump a centerpiece of his campaign announcement. This weekend, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke called for impeachment proceedings against Mr. Trump. Then Senator Kamala Harris did something she's tried to avoid on the trail. She attacked the president directly, saying this president isn't trying to make America great. He's trying to make America hate. So, Ed, to what extent has Joe Biden changed the primary conversation to make this more about the president and less about policy?
See, when he announced it, it sure looked like he was trying to hand out the sniffing salts and remind his competitors that what you're supposed to be focused on is the president and not necessarily squabbling with each other. Now, he makes the argument he's best positioned to take him on. Some of these early numbers suggest he is. But sort of tried to show, and I think he has pretty effectively so far, that you can argue explicitly against the president and talk about what you're going to do at the same time, and there's no need to fear doing both. I actually had a question for Sean based on that fantastic reporting of whether or not, Sean, you got a sense that some of these other campaigns are actually afraid to take on Joe Biden for fear that there could be backlash for the goodwill he enjoys across the party, or that they perhaps aren't equipped to go mano a mano with him and his larger operation.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. I think, for one thing, a lot of these candidates are still trying to introduce themselves to voters. And you look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, he has almost universal name recognition. So he has a luxury that these other candidates don't have. He can go after Biden without it getting in the way of introducing himself to voters. So I think a lot of these lesser-known candidates are reticent to do it because they're doing it at a time when they're trying to introduce their own policies and personalities. But you're right, I think there is also a fear factor. Joe Biden is somebody who engenders a lot of goodwill in the Democratic Party. He has a lot of allies and people who know him and trust him. And if you go after Joe Biden, there is a risk that you alienate not just his core supporters, but potentially swing voters who say, I'm not necessarily the biggest Joe Biden fan, but I don't like candidate X or candidate Y going after him. So I think there is some fear and reticence right now that we're seeing on the part of a lot of these candidates who are not really, really well-known household names right now.
I also want to ask about the political map, because, Caitlin, you sat down with Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw, and you asked him about how his home state of Texas might actually play in 2020. Let's listen to that.
Do you think Texas is a battleground state now?
They're certainly trying to make it a battleground state. I would have worried about, I would say, the older Democratic Party before now. The new Democratic Party I'm not as worried about. When you're talking about a Green New Deal in Houston, Texas, I think that's a losing argument. When you're talking about Medicare for all in Houston, Texas, home of Texas Medical Center, I think that's a losing argument. None of these things are good for Houston, so I'd be very surprised if these messages were actually resonating in Texas.
So it's interesting. He seems very confident about his state. Should he be confident?
Well, we know that Texas is going to be a key battleground, at least in the primary, in the Democratic primary. I was recently in Houston where several candidates were there campaigning and really trying to speak to women voters and women of color. Demographics in places like Houston, where Congressman Crenshaw represents, and other kind of urban city center areas are seeing kind of this explosion in terms of demographics that favor Democrats. And you can point to someone like Beto O'Rourke, who didn't win the Texas Senate race, but came within 3 points of defeating Ted Cruz by running a pretty progressive campaign, and also one that seemed to have inspired people. And so looking at the presidential race, certainly Democrats want to make it a battleground, and they're organizing on the ground to do that. But they're also looking at kind of the infrastructure that's in place, trying to build that up and recruiting candidates to run for different offices. And last week, MJ Hager announced that she would be running for the Senate. That's someone that Democrats hope can help kind of bring out voters across the board here and kind of build on what they did in 2018. So Texas also in the primary is going to be voting earlier than others. It's a huge delegate-rich state and something that Democrats are going to be competing for in the primary and perhaps beyond.
It'll be interesting to see what happens in that particular state. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Sean Sullivan, thank you.